I grew up in a family that valued hard work over everything else. My parents, Thomas and Linda, weren't cruel, but they had this deeply ingrained belief that nothing in life should come easily. We lived in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, where every dollar was accounted for. My father worked as an accountant, and my mother was a school teacher. They drilled into me the importance of saving money, being responsible, and never expecting handouts. Unlike some kids I knew, I never got an allowance just for existing. If I wanted something, I had to earn it. Babysitting, mowing lawns, working part-time at the local grocery store, I did whatever I could to have a little spending money. Even then, I felt like an outsider among my peers. I wasn't the girl with the latest sneakers, the trendy backpack, or the cool family vacations to Europe. I was the girl who wore hand-me-downs and turned down invites to expensive outings because I knew better than to ask my parents for extra cash. By the time I turned 29, I had finally started to build a life of my own. I landed a job at a marketing firm in the city, something I had worked tirelessly for. It wasn't glamorous and I wasn't exactly rich, but it was a step forward. The company had a sleek office space, the kind with glass walls and overpriced coffee machines, and the people who worked there all seemed to have that effortless, put-together aura. That's where I met Julia. Julia was the kind of woman who turned heads the moment she walked into a room. Confident, effortlessly fashionable, and exuding the kind of energy that made people want to be around her. She had a designer bag slung over her shoulder, expensive perfume lingering in the air when she passed. She wasn't just wealthy, she was born into it. Old money. She had this way of making everything look easy. Casual conversations about weekend trips to the Hamptons, complaining about her father's insistence on buying her another car she didn't need, or rolling her eyes at the latest upscale restaurant her friends wanted to try. And somehow, despite how out of place I felt around her, she took an immediate liking to me. "Sarah, you're different," she told me one day over lunch. "You're not boring like the rest of them." I like that. I wasn't sure what she meant, but I didn't question it. At first, I stuck to the truth about my background, trying to keep up without revealing just how different my upbringing had been. But then it happened. The lie. It wasn't planned. It just slipped out during a casual conversation in the break room. We were talking about our parents, and Julia was complaining about her father being too involved in her life. She laughed and said, "Ugh, he's always trying to introduce me to business partners like I actually care about the family companies." I should have just nodded. I should have said something neutral. But instead, I heard myself say, "Oh yeah, my dad's the same way. He's always caught up in business stuff." It was a lie. A stupid, impulsive lie. But Julia's eyes lit up with interest. "Oh? What kind of business?" she asked. I hesitated for half a second, just long enough to dig myself deeper. Real estate. Some other things too. You know, investments, companies, that kind of stuff. It sounded vague enough to be believable, and Julia seemed impressed. "No way. That's insane. Why didn't you mention this before?" I shrugged, trying to act nonchalant, but my heart was pounding. I don't really talk about it much. And just like that, I became someone else. I should have said no. I should have laughed it off, made up an excuse, and walked away from the entire mess before it spiraled even further out of control. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded, forced a smile, and told Julia I'd be there, all while my stomach twisted into knots. The moment the words left my mouth, I knew there was no turning back. This wasn't just a casual dinner or a night out where I could fake a blocked credit card and slip away unnoticed. This was a party on a yacht worth millions, filled with people who actually belonged in the world I had been pretending to be part of. And worst of all, Julia had invited my parents. My real working-class parents, who had never set foot anywhere remotely luxurious in their entire lives, and who would see through my lie the moment they stepped into that world. The panic set in the second I left work that day. My mind raced through every possible way to get out of it, but every excuse I thought of seemed flimsy at best. If I said my parents couldn't come, Julia would ask why. If I said I suddenly had plans, she'd insist I cancel them. If I made up some emergency, she'd offer to reschedule. I had spent weeks crafting the perfect illusion, and now, in one night, it was all about to collapse. The first problem was my parents. I couldn't let them come, that much was obvious. But telling them about the lie was out of the question. They would never understand why I had done it, and worse, they would be furious. My mother, who had spent her entire life teaching me to be honest and humble, would never forgive me for pretending to be something I wasn't. My father, practical and no-nonsense, would see right through every excuse I came up with. There was no way I could involve them in this, which meant I had to come up with a reason for them not to attend, something believable enough that Julia wouldn't push back. Then there was the issue of the party itself. Even if I somehow managed to avoid bringing my parents, I still had to show up and convince everyone there that I belonged. That meant dressing the part, acting the part, and most terrifyingly, talking about a father who didn't exist. Up until now, my vague answers had been enough, but surrounded by billionaires and CEOs, I wouldn't be able to get away with half-truths and general statements. These people actually knew the world I was pretending to be from, and they would expect me to know it too. If I slipped up, if I said something even slightly off, the entire illusion would shatter. For the next 3 days, I did nothing but obsess over the party. I barely ate, barely slept, and spent every free moment researching ways to make my lie more convincing. I memorized real estate jargon, learned the names of top investment firms, and even looked up high-profile developers in case anyone asked specifics about my father's work. But no matter how much I prepared, the truth loomed over me like a storm cloud. I was playing a game I had no chance of winning. On the fourth day, I finally worked up the nerve to tell Julia my parents couldn't make it. I kept my voice light and casual, hoping she wouldn't question it too much. They really wanted to come, but my dad has a last-minute business trip, I said, forcing a small sigh as if I was disappointed. He's always getting pulled into something last minute. You know how it is. Julia didn't even blink. Oh my god, totally. My dad does that all the time. It's like, can you just chill for 1 second? But whatever their loss. You and I are going to have the best time. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. My parents were out of the picture, but the hardest part was still ahead. I needed an outfit, one that would make me look like I belonged on a multi-million-dollar yacht, surrounded by some of the wealthiest people in the country. My usual trick of borrowing from Valeria would work, but this time, I needed something even more impressive. When I texted her, she responded almost immediately, telling me to come by that night. When I arrived, she had already laid out several options, each one more extravagant than the last. You need to go full luxury, she said, running her fingers over a silk gown that looked like it belonged on a red carpet. Yacht parties are a different level. No one does subtle. You either look like money, or you look like an outsider. I swallowed hard, nodding as I reached for a shimmering champagne-colored dress that felt impossibly delicate beneath my fingers. This one? I said, trying not to think about the fact that I had no right to be wearing something so expensive. Valeria raised an eyebrow. You sure? This dress costs more than some people's rent. I forced a laugh, ignoring the gnawing feeling in my stomach. It's perfect. The night of the party arrived faster than I was ready for. When I stepped onto the dock, my breath caught in my throat. The yacht wasn't just big. It was massive, sleek, and gleaming under the lights, with staff members in crisp uniforms ushering guests aboard. Julia spotted me immediately, waving me over with a wide grin. You look incredible, she gushed, taking my hand and pulling me into the crowd. This is going to be the best night ever. For the first hour, I managed to keep myself together. I floated from conversation to conversation, nodding and laughing at all the right moments while carefully steering clear of anything too specific. But then, just as I was starting to believe I might actually pull this off, Julia's father approached. Sarah, right? He extended a hand, his watch glinting under the lights. Julia's told me a lot about you. Said your father's in real estate. Who does he work with? Panic flared in my chest, but I forced a smile, praying my voice wouldn't shake. He works independently, mostly large-scale developments. Julia's father nodded, sipping his drink. Interesting. I know most of the major developers. What's his name? My heart nearly stopped. My mind raced through every possible answer, every way to escape this moment, but there was nothing. No way out. No way to undo the lie. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, another guest joined the conversation, a man who actually worked in real estate. Wait, you're talking about real estate? That's my world. Who's your father? All the air left my lungs as I stood there, frozen, trapped in the lie I had built with no way out. I should have never agreed to this. From the moment Julia invited my parents to the yacht party, I knew it was a disaster waiting to happen, yet I had let the lie grow until it had taken on a life of its own. There was no way to back out without exposing myself, so I did the only thing I could. I told my parents about the invitation, carefully crafting the story to keep them from asking too many questions. I made it seem casual, something I'd barely thought about. Julia's dad throws these ridiculous parties all the time, I said, forcing a laugh. It's honestly more about networking than anything. He loves meeting people in the business world. My mother, ever the worrier, frowned slightly. And he wants to meet us? That seems strange. I shrugged. He's just like that. Thinks family is important in business. My dad, on the other hand, seemed genuinely pleased. Well, that's nice of him. It'll be good to see how those kinds of people operate, he said, and I had to bite my tongue at how painfully true that statement was. Then came the worst part. My mother immediately began planning for the event, carefully selecting what she and my father would wear. I watched in silence as she laid out a simple navy blue dress and my father's best suit, neither of which remotely fit the world they were about to step into. I could have said something. I could have told them that Julia's crowd would be in designer brands, dripping in diamonds, and walking in shoes worth more than our family car. But I didn't. I let them believe they would fit in. The day of the party arrived, and I barely held it together as we approached the dock. The yacht was enormous, glowing under soft golden lights, with guests in shimmering gowns and tailored suits laughing over flutes of champagne. My mother let out a small gasp, gripping my father's arm as they took in the sheer extravagance of it all. I knew it would be fancy, she whispered, her voice tinged with awe, but, my goodness. I forced a smile. Yeah, Julia's family doesn't do small gatherings. I prayed that no one would take too much notice of my parents, that they would slip into the background and not draw any attention to the fact that they so clearly didn't belong. But that hope was shattered within minutes of stepping on board. Julia spotted us instantly, striding over in a silver gown that probably cost more than my yearly salary. Sarah, she called, her eyes flickering between me and my parents. And you must be Mr. and Mrs. Carter. Her tone was pleasant, but I could see it in her eyes. Confusion, curiosity, maybe even a flicker of doubt. My father extended his hand, his grip firm, his demeanor as steady as always. Lovely to meet you, Julia. Sarah's told us a lot about you. Julia smiled, though I could see her gaze flicking over my mother's modest dress, the slight wear on my father's shoes, the way they both stood with an air of polite discomfort. "I'm so glad you could make it," she said smoothly. "Come, let me introduce you to my father." I could barely breathe as we followed her through the crowd, my ears ringing with the murmurs of the other guests. They weren't being cruel, but I could feel the shift in energy, the way eyes lingered just a little too long, the way conversations hushed ever so slightly as we passed. When we finally reached Julia's father, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and the kind of presence that demanded attention, my hands felt clammy at my sides. He smiled as Julia made the introductions, shaking my father's hand with a nod of approval. "So, Thomas," he said, swirling his drink, "Sarah tells me you're in real estate. Always nice to meet someone who understands the business." I could feel the tension in my father's stance before he even opened his mouth. He hesitated for half a second, a moment too long, before he let out a short chuckle. "Oh, well, not quite real estate, actually. I'm an accountant. But I suppose I do work with some real estate firms." I felt the blood drain from my face. Julia's expression barely changed, but I caught the small twitch of her lips, the sharp flicker in her gaze as she processed what he'd just said. I jumped in before the silence could stretch too long. "Oh, he's just being modest," I said, forcing a laugh. "He's worked with so many companies. He basically knows the industry inside and out." Julia's father raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Well, that's valuable knowledge to have," he said easily, though I wasn't sure he entirely believed it. The rest of the evening was a blur of forced smiles and carefully crafted responses. My parents, despite everything, managed to win over many of the guests with their sincerity. My mother, with her warm and genuine nature, charmed the wives of powerful businessmen, while my father impressed a few older gentlemen with his practical knowledge of finance. I should have felt relieved, should have taken comfort in the fact that they weren't being outright rejected. But Julia never took her eyes off me. She was watching, calculating. And then, just as I thought I had survived the night, she struck the final blow. As the party wound down and guests began to disperse, Julia looped her arm through mine and gave me a knowing smile. "So," she said, her voice as smooth as ever, "I was thinking, why don't we have a girls' weekend at your estate?" My heart nearly stopped. "My estate?" I echoed, my mouth suddenly dry. "Yeah," she said, tilting her head slightly. "You're always so busy, and I'd love to see where you grew up. We could have a little getaway, just us." I opened my mouth, scrambling for an excuse, but nothing came out. Julia smiled wider, her grip on my arm tightening ever so slightly. "Unless, of course," she added, her tone deceptively light, "there's something you don't want me to see." And just like that, I knew. She suspected. And this lie was about to come crashing down around me. I had exactly one night to figure out how to get out of the disaster I had created, and no matter how many ways I looked at it, there was no clean escape. Julia had backed me into a corner with her seemingly innocent request to visit my estate, but I wasn't naive enough to believe it was just casual curiosity. She was testing me, probing for cracks in the story I had so carefully crafted, and if I didn't come up with something convincing and fast, everything I had built would come crashing down around me. The thought of admitting the truth made my stomach churn, because it wasn't just about losing Julia's friendship anymore. It was about losing the entire identity I had fabricated, the acceptance I had fought so hard to secure, and the illusion of a life I had worked tirelessly to maintain. Lying was the only option I had left, and I needed to make it a good one. By the time morning arrived, I had a plan, flimsy, dangerous, and reckless, but a plan nonetheless. When I saw Julia at work, I pulled her aside, keeping my voice light and casual as if I wasn't on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I told her that I had spoken with my father the night before, and that, unfortunately, a full-scale renovation was underway at the estate, making it impossible to host guests. I painted a picture of chaos, contractors everywhere, floors being ripped up, furniture covered in protective sheets, dust swirling through the air, and I made sure to throw in details that made the lie feel more real, casually mentioning how my mother was stressed about choosing between Italian marble or custom wood paneling for the ballroom, how my father had decided to expand the wine cellar, and how the entire ordeal was costing more money than expected but would be worth it in the end. Julia listened intently, her face unreadable, and for a moment, I thought she might believe me, but then she tilted her head slightly and asked, almost too casually, when the renovations would be done. The question caught me off guard, and I had to resist the urge to panic as I quickly responded that the timeline kept shifting because of material delays, but it would likely take another few months. She nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on me just a little too long, and even though she didn't call me out on anything, I could feel it in my bones. She didn't fully believe me. I had bought myself time, but not trust, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she asked more questions, which meant I needed to go one step further. If I wanted to make this lie bulletproof, I needed proof, something tangible that would solidify the illusion and keep suspicion at bay. That's when I remembered a luxury real estate agency I had followed for months on social media, a company that specialized in renting high-end mansions for photo shoots, influencer content, and private events. I had seen one of their listings recently, a breathtaking $10 million estate with a massive garden, infinity pool, and marble-floored foyer, and it looked exactly like the kind of place I had been describing to Julia and her friends. Without giving myself time to second-guess, I called the agency, disguising my voice with as much confidence as I could muster, and told them I was a social media consultant working on a personal branding project that required an upscale setting. The agent barely hesitated before offering me a short-term rental package, rattling off an eye-watering price for a single-day booking, and even though I felt physically ill wiring over the deposit, I told myself it was necessary. Now came the hardest part, getting my parents to go along with it. That night, I sat them down and told them another carefully constructed lie, explaining that Julia had been eager to see the house, but because of the renovations, I had come up with a creative alternative. I told them I had found a property that resembled our own and thought it would be fun to stage a few lifestyle photos there, just for social media, just to keep up appearances, just to make sure no one asked any more questions. My mother looked at me with pure confusion, clearly struggling to understand why any of this was necessary, while my father's expression remained unreadable, but after several minutes of coaxing, they hesitantly agreed, though I could tell they weren't comfortable with it. The next morning, we drove out to the estate, and the moment we stepped through the grand entrance, I could see the unease settling into my parents' faces. My mother, ever the modest woman, ran her fingers lightly over the pristine marble countertops and muttered under her breath about how excessive everything was, while my father remained mostly silent, his eyes scanning the massive space as if trying to comprehend how anyone could justify living like this. I barely had time to dwell on their reactions because I needed to get the photos done quickly, so I rushed them through different rooms, instructing them to pose by the fireplace, to stand near the garden, to sit in the oversized leather chairs in the study, and though they looked deeply uncomfortable in every single shot, I managed to get enough material to make it work. That evening, I carefully selected the best images, edited them to perfection, and posted them online with casual captions, making sure to include just the right amount of detail to make them seem authentic. I wrote about how slow the renovations were, about how I couldn't wait for the final reveal, about how lucky I felt to have grown up in such a special place, and within minutes, the likes and comments started flooding in, filled with admiration and envy. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled, thinking maybe, just maybe, I had gotten away with it. But the illusion didn't last long. A few days later, I was having lunch with Julia and her friends when Claire, one of the more observant ones in the group, suddenly frowned at her phone and turned to me with a curious expression. She held up her screen, revealing a real estate listing, and asked if it was the same house from my photos. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the image on her phone. It was the exact mansion I had rented, now listed publicly as a high-end rental property, available for photo shoots, corporate events, and luxury getaways. I forced a casual laugh, telling her that my father's company sometimes worked with luxury properties, that we had a few in our portfolio that were used for rentals while awaiting final development, and though she nodded, I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. Julia, however, said nothing, just watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and that silence unnerved me more than anything. I thought I had managed to deflect the situation, but then Julia invited me to a small, intimate dinner party at her family's penthouse, and from the moment I arrived, I could feel that something was off. The energy in the room was different. The conversations felt sharper, and I noticed more than once that her friends exchanged glances when I spoke. Dinner was tense, and just as the plates were being cleared, Julia leaned forward with a slow, knowing smile and told me she had reached out to a friend in real estate, someone who knew the market well, and had shown him the pictures from my estate. She let the silence stretch, letting the weight of her words settle in, before adding that he immediately recognized it as one of the most popular rental properties in the city. My stomach twisted into knots, and for the first time, I had no lie prepared. No excuse lined up, nothing to shield me from the weight of the truth crashing down around me. Claire set her fork down with a quiet finality, Adam shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and the room felt suffocating as every single pair of eyes turned to me, waiting for me to speak, waiting for me to explain, waiting for me to admit what they already knew. And then Julia, her voice deceptively light but laced with something sharp and unyielding, leaned forward just slightly and asked, "Sarah, tell me the truth." I had never known silence could be so loud until that moment, standing in Julia's dining room, with every set of eyes locked onto me, waiting for my response, waiting for me to say something, anything, that could explain away the mess I had created. But there was nothing left to say, no more excuses, no more carefully crafted lies that could smooth over the cracks, no more half-truths that could buy me time, no more dodging the inevitable. Because Julia had cornered me, and the only thing I could hear, louder than my own racing heartbeat, was her voice, calm but cutting, demanding an answer I could no longer avoid. "Sarah, tell me the truth." I could feel my hands trembling under the table, my breathing shallow, my throat tightening as if my own body was trying to choke back the confession before it could escape, because once I said it, once I admitted what I had done, there would be no undoing it, no way to repair the damage, no way to pretend everything was fine, but I could see it in Julia's face, in the way her eyes burned with quiet fury, in the way Claire sat back with her arms crossed, in the way Adam refused to look at me, in the way Marcus watched me with a smirk, as if he had always suspected something was off, but now he had the confirmation he needed, and in that moment, I realized that they all knew, that even if I denied it, even if I tried to fight my way out of this, it wouldn't matter, because the truth was already hanging in the air between us, suffocating, undeniable, and inescapable. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry, my entire body locked in place, every nerve screaming at me to run, to get up from the table, to escape before I had to face the consequences, but there was nowhere to go, no way out, no option left except to admit what I had spent so long avoiding, and when I finally spoke, my voice came out quiet, barely above a whisper, as I forced the words out of my mouth, hating every second of it, but knowing that prolonging the inevitable would only make it Worse. Yes. Julia's expression didn't change, but I saw Claire's shift in her seat, heard the sharp exhale of disbelief from one of the others, felt the weight of the silence grow even heavier, but Julia wasn't going to let me get away with vague admissions, wasn't going to allow me to leave anything unsaid, wasn't going to give me even the smallest chance to retreat back into my carefully crafted world of deception. Because she leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked onto mine, her voice even colder than before as she pushed for more. Yes, what? My pulse pounded in my ears, my fingers curling into fists beneath the table as I forced myself to meet her gaze, knowing there was only one way forward now. No more escape routes, no more elaborate stories, no more pretending. Yes, I lied. The second the words left my mouth, the tension in the room shifted, a low whistle from Marcus cutting through the silence as Claire scoffed, shaking her head in disgust, pushing her chair back as if she couldn't stand to be near me any longer, while Adam finally looked up, his face unreadable, his eyes flickering between me and Julia as if waiting for her to decide how bad this was really going to get. Julia let out a slow breath, leaning back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest as she studied me, her face unreadable, but her silence more damning than any words she could have said, because the disappointment in her eyes, the quiet anger simmering beneath the surface, told me that whatever chance I had of salvaging this, of repairing the damage, of keeping even the smallest part of our friendship intact, was already gone. You really had us fooled, she said finally, her voice quiet but laced with something sharp, something unyielding, something final, and before I could say anything, before I could even attempt to explain, to apologize, to beg for some kind of understanding, she stood up from the table, pushing her chair back with an abrupt finality that made it clear this conversation was over, that I was over, that whatever I had been to her, whatever I had pretended to be, whatever illusion I had tried so desperately to maintain, was shattered beyond repair. I think you should leave. There was no argument to be made, no defense I could offer that would change anything, no amount of pleading that would make her see me as anything other than what I really was, and so I stood on shaky legs, my entire body numb, my face burning with humiliation as I turned away from the table, from the people who had once welcomed me into their world, from the friends I had spent so much time trying to impress, and walked out the door, forcing myself not to look back, because looking back would make it real, would make the loss of everything I had built undeniable, and I wasn't ready to face the weight of what I had just lost. But the world didn't let me escape. By the time I got home, my phone was already vibrating with notifications, messages flooding in faster than I could process, my name suddenly everywhere, my face plastered across group chats I had never even known existed, my carefully curated Instagram posts being dissected and torn apart, side-by-side comparisons with real estate listings exposing every single lie, and the captions beneath them were brutal, mocking, relentless, turning me from an invisible nobody into a public joke overnight. As if my humiliation wasn't already complete, as if the universe needed to ensure that there was nothing left of the person I had pretended to be. Work wasn't any better, because even though no one said anything directly to me, I could feel the shift the second I walked through the office doors, the stolen glances, the hushed whispers, the way conversations would suddenly die the moment I entered the room, as if I had become something less than human, something not worth acknowledging, something unworthy of even basic politeness, and while my manager didn't fire me, didn't call me into her office for an official reprimand, I could tell. She knew, could see the change in how she spoke to me. The way she hesitated before assigning me projects, the way she looked at me with quiet disapproval, as if she was already weighing whether or not I was worth keeping around. The only person who didn't turn her back on me was Anna, one of Julia's quieter friends, the one who had always seemed slightly out of place in their group, the one who, unlike the rest of them, hadn't been born into wealth but had worked her way into their world, though without ever pretending to be someone she wasn't, and when she found me sitting alone during lunch, staring blankly at my phone, too numb to even process the sheer scale of my downfall, she sat down across from me without hesitation, her voice calm but firm as she told me that Julia and her friends were cruel, not for exposing me, but for how they were handling it, because they thrived on drama, on social destruction, on building people up just to revel in their downfall, and she told me that while I had made a mistake, a massive mistake, I wasn't the only liar in that group, that they all faked parts of their lives. The only difference was that they had the money to back up the illusion, while I had only ever been playing pretend. But it didn't matter, because Julia was never going to forgive me, not because of the lie itself, but because I had embarrassed her, had made her look foolish, had made her believe in something that wasn't real, and for that, she would never let me back in, would never allow me to repair what I had broken, would never let me exist in her world again, and as I sat there, staring down at my untouched food, listening to Anna tell me that maybe, in the long run, this was a blessing, I realized that. It didn't matter how I tried to justify it, how much I wanted to undo it, because the truth was simple. Everything I had built was gone, and I had no one to blame but myself. I had always thought that when a lie unraveled, the worst part would be the moment of exposure, the sharp sting of humiliation, the weight of judgment pressing down on me in real time, but I was wrong. Because the real pain wasn't in the night Julia forced me to confess, or in the messages that flooded my phone in the days after, or even in the way my coworkers quietly distanced themselves from me. It was in the slow, grinding realization that I had to rebuild everything from the ground up with nothing but the truth, with no shortcuts, no illusions, no carefully curated image to hide behind, and for the first time in months, I had to figure out who I actually was outside of the person I had pretended to be. At first, I didn't know where to begin, because every option I considered felt tainted by the mess I had left behind. Every attempt to move forward felt like walking barefoot through broken glass, but surprisingly, it was Anna who gave me the first real opportunity to start over, because while the rest of Julia's group had either cut me off completely or simply faded out of my life without a word, Anna was the only one who had stayed, the only one who had sat across from me in the aftermath and told me that while I had made a mistake, it didn't have to define the rest of my life. And when she casually mentioned that her husband, Daniel, ran a creative agency and was always looking for new freelancers, I didn't think much of it at first, assuming she was just trying to make me feel better. But a few days later, she texted me with an offer. A high-end branding project that paid more than anything I had ever made in my full-time job. Something so wildly out of reach that I had to reread the message 3 times before I believed it was real. I met with Daniel later that week in a quiet cafe, half expecting him to grill me about my past, to ask about the scandal that had turned me into a punchline, but instead, he skimmed through my portfolio, nodded thoughtfully, and said, "Look, Anna told me what happened, and honestly, I don't care about all that. I care about whether or not you can do the work, and from what I've seen, you can, so if you want this, it's yours." I had never felt more relieved in my life, because after weeks of feeling like I was drowning in judgment, of walking through the world with a neon sign above my head flashing liar, fraud, pathetic, someone was finally offering me a chance based on what I could actually do, not on who I had pretended to be, and so I threw myself into the project, working harder than I ever had, determined to prove that I was more than the wreckage of my past mistakes, and by the time the campaign launched, not only had Daniel's clients been thrilled with the results, but he had already lined up another contract for me, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was regaining control over my life. Not through deception, not through pretending, but through actual effort, through work that I could stand behind without fear of it being exposed as fake. As my freelancing career took off, I found myself reconnecting with people I had once pushed aside in my desperate climb toward Julia's world, old friends and acquaintances who had never judged me, who had never made me feel like I wasn't enough, who had been there long before I had started weaving lies to impress people who ultimately hadn't cared about me beyond the surface. And while I had expected them to look at me with the same quiet disapproval I had seen in my coworkers' eyes, to remind me of what I had done, to make me relive the shame of my downfall, instead, they welcomed me back without hesitation, without conditions, without forcing me to beg for forgiveness, because to them, I wasn't the sum of my worst mistakes. I was just Sarah, the same person I had always been, even if I had lost sight of that for a while. It was during one of those long late-night conversations with an old friend, when I was venting about everything, about how I had gotten so lost in the illusion, about how easy it had been to slip into the lie and how impossible it had been to escape it, that someone jokingly said, "You know, you should write about this, turn it into a cautionary tale," and at first, I laughed, dismissing the idea outright. Because why would anyone want to read about my mistakes? Why would anyone care about the self-inflicted disaster I had barely crawled out of? But the thought lingered, and one night, on a whim, I started writing. Not to justify myself, not to seek sympathy, but simply to put it all down in words, to untangle everything that had led me to that moment, to make sense of the mess I had created. I didn't expect anyone to read it, but when I posted my first blog entry, a raw and brutally honest account of how one small lie had spiraled into something I could no longer control, the response was immediate, and within days, strangers were messaging me, not with insults or ridicule, but with their own confessions, their own stories of deception, of insecurity, of chasing validation in all the wrong places. And before I knew it, my inbox was flooded with people who saw parts of themselves in my experience, people who had made their own mistakes, who had pretended, who had lived in fear of being found out, and somehow, my story had resonated with them in a way I had never expected. The blog took on a life of its own, growing far beyond anything I had imagined, leading to interviews, features, and opportunities that I never would have believed possible, and for the first time in my life, people weren't interested in me because of the illusion I had created. They were interested in me because of my truth, because of the raw honesty that I had once been so afraid to show. And as terrifying as it was to put everything out there, to lay bare every mistake, every regret, every painful moment of my downfall, it was also freeing. Because I no longer had to hide, no longer had to pretend, no longer had to keep up a facade that had been exhausting to maintain. And then, one day, out of nowhere, I got a message from Julia. I had never expected to hear from her again, had accepted that whatever friendship we had once had was beyond saving, but she asked if we could meet, and even though I knew there was no fixing what had been broken, I couldn't say no, because I owed her that much. Owed her an apology that wasn't clouded by the shame and panic of that disastrous dinner, owed her the chance to say whatever she needed to say, even if it meant facing the last lingering pieces of the humiliation I had been trying to move past. When we met, she was distant but calm, her demeanor cool but not cruel, and as I apologized, as I admitted that I had been selfish, that I had hurt her, that I had manipulated my way into her life under false pretenses, she listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she sighed, running a hand through her hair before finally meeting my eyes, and in that moment, I knew that even if she understood, even if she accepted my apology, even if she didn't hate me anymore, things would never go back to the way they were. "I get why you did it," she said finally, her voice softer than I expected but still firm, still resolute. "And I don't hate you, Sarah. But I can't be your friend again." I nodded, because I had known that before she even said it, had known that some things, once broken, couldn't be put back together, and as much as it hurt, as much as I wished I could undo everything, I accepted it, Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't chasing something that wasn't mine to have, wasn't trying to force my way into a life that wasn't meant for me, wasn't pretending to be someone I wasn't. And as I walked away from that conversation, I realized that even though I had lost Julia, even though I had lost everything I had built on lies, I had finally found something real, something that wasn't built on deception, something that I could truly call my own. I had spent so long pretending to be someone else that I had forgotten what it felt like to just exist without the weight of a lie pressing down on me. For months, my every move had been calculated, every word carefully chosen to maintain the illusion of wealth and status, every social interaction laced with the underlying fear of exposure. But now, with everything out in the open, with no more need for deception, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: relief. It wasn't an immediate, euphoric kind of relief, not the kind that came with a grand realization or a sudden sense of freedom, but a slow, quiet exhale, a gradual unburdening of the layers of falsehood I had wrapped myself in for so long, a lightness that came not from gaining something new, but from letting go of everything I no longer had to carry. At first, the emptiness left behind by my old life felt almost unbearable. Without Julia's circle, without the constant effort of maintaining my fabricated image, without the endless cycle of social events, designer outfits, and staged photos, I didn't know who I was supposed to be, didn't know how to move forward when my entire world had collapsed so spectacularly. But the more time I spent outside of that world, the more I realized that what I had lost wasn't something I needed to mourn, because for the first time in years, I was surrounding myself with people who didn't require me to pretend, who didn't care about the clothes I wore or the places I went or the connections I had, people who knew me before I had started lying and who, despite everything, still wanted me in their lives. I rebuilt my social circle slowly, hesitantly, unsure of how to approach friendships without the safety net of wealth and status to fall back on, but the people I reconnected with, old acquaintances, coworkers who hadn't distanced themselves after the scandal, even new clients I met through my freelance work, never asked me to be anything other than myself. There were no expectations, no pressure to prove my worth through material things, no unspoken competition to outdo one another, and the absence of that constant tension, that ever-present anxiety of not measuring up, was something I hadn't even realized I needed until it was gone. For the first time in years, I didn't have to check my words before I spoke, didn't have to wonder if my background would make me seem lesser, didn't have to carefully construct an identity that would impress the people around me. I could talk about my actual childhood without feeling ashamed, could mention my parents without worrying about how they would be perceived, could laugh about the struggles of growing up in a household where money had always been tight without feeling like I was admitting to some kind of personal failure. And with that realization came another, one that was harder to face but impossible to ignore. I had spent so much time being ashamed of my parents, of their modest life, of the simple, practical values they had instilled in me, that I had failed to see the immense strength in everything they had given me. While I had been chasing a life built on illusion, they had been living one of quiet honesty, of hard work, of sacrifices I had never fully appreciated until now. I saw it in my mother's hands, rough from years of grading papers late into the night, in my father's careful budgeting, in the way they had always found a way to provide, even when it meant going without for themselves, and the more time I spent with them, the more I realized that I had spent years running from something that was never meant to be escaped, because the life they had given me, the values they had tried to teach me, were not something to be ashamed of, they were something to be proud of. For the first time since my downfall, I told them the full truth, not just the facts of what had happened, but the emotions behind it, the insecurity, the fear of never being enough, the desperation to belong, and instead of the anger I had expected, instead of the harsh judgment I had feared, they simply listened. My mother held my hand as I spoke, her eyes filled with quiet sadness, not for herself, but for me, for the years I had spent believing that I had to be someone else to be worthy of love and respect. My father, ever the practical man, simply said, "I wish you had told us sooner." And those words, so simple yet so filled with understanding, nearly broke me, because I had spent so long convinced that they would never forgive me for what I had done, when in reality, they had only ever wanted me to be honest, with them and with myself. And maybe it was that shift, that newfound acceptance of where I came from, that allowed me to finally open myself up to something I had long avoided, real, genuine intimacy. The kind that wasn't built on status or appearances or carefully constructed identities, but on something far deeper, something I had spent years convincing myself I wasn't worthy of. I met Ryan through one of my freelance projects, a photographer who had been hired to shoot a campaign for a luxury brand I was working with, and from the moment we met, he saw through me in a way that no one else ever had. He wasn't impressed by wealth or status, wasn't interested in the social games I had once played, wasn't drawn in by the superficial charm I had spent years perfecting, and unlike everyone I had surrounded myself with in my old life, he had no illusions about who I was. He knew about the scandal, had heard the whispers, had seen the posts that still occasionally resurfaced in certain circles, but when I hesitantly brought it up one night over dinner, expecting the same wary distance I had gotten from so many others, he simply shrugged and said, "Everyone screws up, Sarah. The important thing is what you do after." There was no pity in his voice, no judgment, just a quiet understanding that left me completely disarmed, because for so long, I had been waiting for someone to see past my mistakes, to believe that I could be more than the worst thing I had ever done, and here was someone who didn't need convincing, who had already made up his mind that I was worth knowing, worth caring about, worth loving. Not because of who I had pretended to be, but because of who I was, flaws and all. And as our relationship deepened, as I let him into the parts of myself I had once been too ashamed to show, I realized that this, more than anything else, was what I had been searching for. Not wealth, not status, not the approval of people who would never truly accept me, but the freedom to exist without pretense, to love and be loved without conditions, to finally, for the first time in my life, believe that I was enough. I no longer needed validation from strangers, no longer craved the artificial sense of belonging that had once driven me to such desperate lengths, no longer felt the urge to measure my worth in designer labels and exclusive invitations, because I had built something real, something solid, something that didn't require constant maintenance to keep from falling apart. And maybe that was the greatest lesson of all, not that I had lost everything, but that I had finally found what truly mattered, that authenticity, no matter how imperfect, was always worth more than any illusion. That the life I had once been so desperate to leave behind had never been something to escape, but something to embrace, and as I stood on the other side of everything I had been through, looking at the life I had built from the ashes of my mistakes, I finally understood that I had never needed to be anyone other than myself.